So to just, be wary of, people coming up to you and talking to you. There's, when we used to give briefing for executives when, in the Web 2 world and especially in banking, when they're traveling overseas, again, be on the lookout for, you're at the hotel bar and, somebody comes up and sits down next to you and starts talking to you. Could be friendly, and it could be somebody that knows that you're here from such and such bank or in Web3 world, such and such project. And they're just trying to gain your trust. So that way they can, when you go to the bathroom, they can, go into your bag and, put something in there. So again, just know that this stuff is happening, I think is probably the biggest takeaway from this talk. It's just, this stuff isn't just in the movies. It actually is happening. It's techniques that have been used for years and years and years and years.
Don't worry, we are friends.
Hello and welcome, Friends Validator community. I'm your host, Juri Maibaum, co-founder and host of Friends Validator. And today I have the pleasure to welcome David Schwed from Halborn to the show. Halborn is maybe the most famous auditing company in Web3. They make sure that all of the code that is out there is secure, or like a lot of parts of it. So yeah, David, thank you so much for joining. I'm so happy to have you on.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. And today I want to pick up a conversation that we had at Avalanche Summit 2023 in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago. We talked about security mistakes that founders, but also the average user does in Web3, and how to prevent these. We also talked about how the industry becomes more secure over time, and also Halborn's role in the industry. But before we do all of that, it would be super nice if you could give us like an introduction of yourself and also touch a little bit about your journey in the industry, starting from the security sector in general and then ending up in Web3.
Sure. So I really had like three phases of my career, and the first part of my career was in traditional finance. So I actually started my first job working at Citibank or Citicorp. So my entire existence has been in enterprise environments, enterprise level security. And the early part of my career was a transition from being just a techie. I was working on server infrastructure. And then I started transitioning into risk management and into internal audit. And that was like a light bulb moment for me to understand risk as it relates to technology. So as I transitioned into internal audit, and now I'm working with the business lines and saying, okay, well, what are the risks to the business? Should there be some sort of control gap within the environment? What is the actual impact to the business? And it was really the marrying of those two different concepts, which really, really excited me. Not to be like a little funny here, but it was really something that like awoken inside of me of, well, wait a second, hold on. I'm not just a technologist that's keeping the lights blinking. There's an actual impact to the business should the blinking lights go off, or if there's a security vulnerability, there's an actual material, substantive impact to the business, whether it's regulatory, whether it's compensatory, whether we get fined, whether it's a loss of business, or whether it's a reputation. Like in the internal audit world, at least in the United States, there's a concept of the New York Times test. If this particular control failed, would the bank or would that particular institution end up on the front page of the New York Times from like a data breach? If you think back to like Target, for example, in the US, when there was a large Target breach and, credit card numbers were leaked. So it really excited me. And, I spent a couple of years floating back and forth between different banks and various risk management roles. So I spent a couple of years doing vendor risk management. Like I said, I was doing internal audit. I also spent a number of years in proper information security, doing some threat forensic and surveillance. I was a threat hunter for a number of years. Also doing threat assessment. So I was doing, threat research on emerging threats in the financial services sector. So I would draft up reports. Some of them would, be presented to the board of directors, which in turn would increase, funding for our department. So I did that up until about 2008. 2008, I co-founded a telecommunications company. I've always had the entrepreneurial bug inside of me. So I stood up in a telecommunications company, which we ran for about 10 years. We were acquired back in 2018. And while I was running my company is really when I got really interested in blockchain. And it wasn't necessarily something at the time that I thought, hey, this is going to be worth money. It was more about hey, this is a decentralized ledger that is cryptographically sound and it's immutable. And it was just a really interesting concept for me because, as a technologist, I'm always looking for risk management. I'm always looking for resiliency and backup. And here's something that in theory solved both of it. It's immutable, so it's indisputable that the transaction on the chain was, not necessarily accurate, but you can prove that whoever had the key made the transaction. And on the other side, from a resiliency perspective, you have the ability to have this, decentralized ledger across multiple nodes all over the world. So I looked at it more from a technological perspective, and that was back in around 2012. When I exited my company, there was an opportunity to join Galaxy Digital at the time. So it was very early, maybe about 50 or 60 people. So for me, also for being an entrepreneur, I looked at this as an opportunity to stand up a brand new cybersecurity program in an environment that did not have a rule book. We didn't have a framework. There was no NIST framework. There still isn't a NIST framework. There wasn't this, copy and rinse and repeat from the last 20 years. So for me, as an entrepreneur, for someone who loves technology, it was a really exciting challenge of what are the new emerging threats in this area, and how can we combat them? So I did that for about a year. I've always wanted to get into academia, so I joined a university in New York to stand up their cybersecurity master's program. So I did that. Also, going back to my telecom roots, I was the CIO of a subsea cable company, which I did for about 2 years. And then I got a call that BNY Mellon was looking for someone to head up their digital assets technology organization. So for me, again, entrepreneur, brand new organization, in a brand new field. I could take all of my enterprise level banking experience that I've had for the past 20 some odd years, couple it with the last 10 years that I've been doing in digital assets, and kind of, again, marry the two and, help stand up this new organization within BNY Mellon, where, we started to work on the things like that you see today, like the custody solution. So while I was there, one of the organizations that I was, looking to potentially bring in, was Halborn. And I got to know the team really well, and an opportunity arose, and started talking to Rob and Steve, the founders, and now I'm over at Halborn.
Yeah, that's indeed a very, very interesting story that you just shared here. I mean, you experienced a lot, and you've also worked in the most different sectors. And I've also find it interesting that you left the banking sector in 2008 and went into tech, which is like, a funny coincidence. But talking about CV, so what does the typical CV of someone who audits smart contracts and blockchains and all of this Web3 stuff, what does a CV of such a person usually looks like? What does he do, and what is some general advice that you would give to someone who is a developer and wants to take the next step?
Sure. So I think it's first important to understand that someone who is a developer is not a security person. And conversely, somebody who is a security person generally isn't a full-time developer. Now, you can have somebody that has a developer that has a security mindset and security background, and vice versa. But generally, we don't find this unicorn of a developer who also has, years of experience as a security professional, because there are diametrically opposed principles between the two different positions. Someone who's a developer is just developing an application because they want something to launch the market, and not necessarily that they're cutting corners, but they have deadlines. They want to release something to market. On the other side, security person wants to make this as many roadblocks as possible. We want to have as many controls in place. We want to do everything really slow and methodical. So those two generally don't align. So when you're looking for someone to do like an assessment of a smart contract, the skill sets, you really have two choices. It's either find a developer who understands Solidity or Rust, whatever, layer one you're particularly talking about, and teach them different security principles. Or conversely, find someone who's a red teamer, a security person, and present this opportunity to them that this is code that is executed in maybe a different type of environment or a different structure of the code that you're particularly used to, but they have that security mindset. Personally, what I think works best is finding someone with a deep security background, and this is just a new challenge for them, a new code base potentially. Again, this is not a completely brand new language. It's all based off of pre-existing languages. So I find that that's been where we've been most successful. Now, not to say that there's not a use case for developers on the security side, because they'll also understand the challenges that developers are facing. So I think it's kind of, again, marrying of the two. So you have the security mindset, but then you also have to hire and maintain, just standard blockchain developers, and people just understand the ecosystem in the space. And I think that's what works best.
Yeah, and I think we see the necessity for these jobs because, we see this on a shockingly regular basis. There are a lot of exploits these days. What are your thoughts on the talent pool of people who enter the sector right now? And say I would study now software engineering. What would be the steps for someone who's like very young still, who graduated college or whatever? What would be your advice here, and how do you view the talent pool of people entering the sector?
So I definitely think there's a talent skills shortage, number one, of people, and also of just understanding what's needed to uplift our environment in order to really participate in the enterprise ecosystem. This isn't an industry that's been around for 20 or 30 years where people have had the benefit of, just learning. So, when I talk to, again, from my academia background, when I talk to people that want to enter in the cybersecurity space, I tell them, hold off. Before you learn how to secure technology, you have to actually understand how the technology works. So if I was advising somebody today that wants to become a smart contract auditor or just enter into blockchain security, the first thing is just get a really good understanding of how technology works. Forget blockchain for now. Understand just network infrastructure, understand OSI layers, understand what is a packet, what is layer 2 versus layer 3 versus layer 7, how does an IPsec tunnel work, how does HTTPS, even at a basic level, if I'm going to, CNN or Fox News, whatever affiliation you're side in the US, when you hit enter, what's actually happening? How do routers route? So, because once you understand just general network infrastructure, host infrastructure, how does the cloud work, what is Kubernetes, what is Docker, then you can take a step back and say, well, okay, now that I understand how everything communicates and how everything connects, how can I go now and secure it? Because you'll have different tactics. You can protect something at a network layer, you can protect something at a host layer, you can have detective controls, because now I know if A is communicating to B, and I can now understand how IP packets work and payloads, I can now maybe use deep packet inspection. So it's really understanding how technology works first before you jump in and try to secure it. And I think that's really where I think a lot of our issue is today, is that people are just jumping right into security without really fully understanding, like, how does this work? If I pull a blockchain developer aside and just say, at a very basic level, explain to me PKI, what is public and private key cryptography? How does it work? What is it? What's asymmetric encryption versus symmetric encryption? These are very basic, security terms. It's not anything that's overly complex. I'm not, suggesting somebody become a cryptographer, but to understand just general key management and HSMs. I think HSMs is probably, something that, banks have been using for 30, 40 years, whatever it is. But if you pull somebody from the blockchain world and say, walk me through what an HSM is, they're not going to understand if I say, explain to me FIPS 142, level 3 or level 4 compliant. These are just basic things that are understood and accepted in the enterprise world that I think are just not understood in the blockchain world.
And would you say that, you mentioned here the blockchain world, but would you say that Web 2 companies, or like that the Web 2 cybersecurity space faces the same issues in terms of like people just jumping into cybersecurity, or is Web 2 a little bit less affected of this?
It's a little bit less affected for a couple of reasons. One is, number one, there's more established companies somewhat in the Web 2 space, so they've been around longer, they have, different funding schedules, so they might be on their Series B, Series C, Series D, or just, generally a profitable company that's running. The talent pool is much larger. Number one, we have an issue, like I said, with people just afraid to enter into the blockchain space or enter into a bear market, and they see layoffs. So there's a lot of really talented people in the Web 2 world that I personally know that just won't, at this stage, enter into the blockchain world just from job security. So you have people that have been, doing Web 2 security for, the last X amount of years that just maybe don't want to make the jump into Web 3. So I think the talent pool is definitely greater. It's been around longer. So there is a playbook. You can just generally follow the NIST framework, or follow COBIT or COSO or ITIL. There's general frameworks that are set in standard that protect the Web 2 world. And while there are organizations, for example, such as C4 that is coming out with the CCSS standards that are, developing standards in the Web 3 world, they're still somewhat new and emerging, and there hasn't been, the same sort of, push from the community to do the self-regulation that we see in the Web 2 world.
Okay, so to conclude this a little bit correctly, so you're saying that there are cybersecurity people who would be qualified for also operating in Web 3, but they don't want to enter Web 3 at this point because they're like happy in their Web 2 world. And then on the other hand, we have people who like randomly want to jump into Web 3 cybersecurity before even understanding the basics, correct?
Correct. So the people in Web 2, I don't think are a lift and, plop into Web 3. But if somebody is a technologist and somebody's been doing security for X amount of years, these are not inherently new concepts. Custodying of keys in crypto is really key management in the Web 2 world. Now, you might need to add on additional layers of controls. You might need to look at it through a different lens because the threat is higher. So you might need to implement new types of controls. But at the end of the day, it's key management. It's HSMs, if we know MPC, whatever it is, that exists in the Web 2 world. It's just you might have to do it a little bit differently in the Web 3 world. And then when we're talking about, on-chain and looking for anomalies in behavior, we do that today in Web 2. We have seams, we have the ability to ingest and aggregate data and look for contextualization and correlation of anomalies in behavior. It's just a different set of data that we're looking there, but it's the same principles in Web 2 that we can uplift and put into Web 3. But a lot of those people, are afraid to make that jump just because of, the volatility in the job market.
Yeah, and now let's talk about the sector. Let's talk about Web3. I mean, we see dozens of Web3 exploits almost monthly, but how do Web2 companies actually manage their security? So, I mean, they don't have the responsibility over blockchain bridges or so, but of course they are also in charge of other assets, i.e. private user data, aka data is in your oil. Then they also hold crypto partially these days, and then they also spend money online for their employees, for example. So can you give us a broad overview how they manage their IT security?
Sure. The first thing is, if you just want to do a comparison, I would say, and again, I'm not talking about like the Coinbases of the world, but if you look at like a decently popular Web3 project, look on LinkedIn, just look at the security staff versus a similar size company in the Web2 space. You're going to see more maturity, number one, in the team. You're going to see maybe a CISO that has been around the block a couple of times. You're going to see directors of security. You might see some network security people. So the team, number one, is really fleshed out. What I see in the Web3 world is like, let's look for the unicorn of one person that knows everything about security. And there isn't, right? If you're looking at a well-established Web2 organization, you need subject matter experts in different domains. A network security expert is not the same person, who has the same skill set, that knows how to secure hosts or, that can run a security operations center. So first off, I think that there's the structure of the team is a little bit more realistic as to what is needed to secure an organization. Again, I see Web3 organizations just looking for that unicorn of an individual. And sometimes it's really just security theater. Let's take this person who is a blockchain developer and poof, you're now in charge of security, and we're going to make you a CISO because it looks good to the outside world that we have somebody in charge of security. But again, look under the hood and look at that person's background. They've never been a security person prior to that. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is we do have those frameworks. We do have those NIST, and we do have COSO, we do have ITIL. So they do have the ability to follow a framework that is deemed to be accepted by the industry as like, this is a good baseline to be at. We don't have that in the Web3 world. The other piece of it, honestly, is just tools, right? There's tons and tons. Go to RSA, go to Black Hat. You'll see tons of vendors with tools in the Web2 space. Look like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne. There's really no equivalent from a maturity perspective that exists in the Web3. So the Web2 just has the ability to just go to a vendor and buy a bunch of tools that do data loss prevention, that will do key management, that will do endpoint detection and response. There's just so many tools that are available in the Web2 space that just don't yet exist in the Web3. The other issue is, a lot of Web2 is closed source. Again, there's always this debate in the community of what's better, open versus closed. We can talk about that a little bit later, but if something is closed source, you are removing somewhat some of the intel for a potential threat actor. If they can actually look through line by line through code, they might be able to find an exploit that they're not necessarily going to find if it's compiled code. So I think that's the other issue that we're dealing with in Web3. By design, everything is open, which is great, but because everything is open, you have the best threat actors in the world that are actually able to pour, eyes on glass and look through the code. Whereas in the Web2 world, things are generally closed source. So, those tools are not necessarily there for the hackers. So they have to do, their exploits written a little bit differently. And I think the other issue is just the threat actors are moving to Web3 just because these are bare assets. Whoever holds them actually has cash. It's literally robbing a vault in a bank and just walking out with cash. In the Web2 world, you have to jump through a couple of hoops in order to monetize your exploit. So, take Target. I have to now hack Target. Now I have to steal people's credit card numbers. Now I have to go to the black market and I have to sell those, stolen, personal identifying information or credit card numbers on the black market, receive funds, and then figure out what to do with it. Web3 is I just bypassed all that steps and just stole the money directly. So I think it's a combination of all of that is really what we're seeing.
Yeah, so for me, it sounds like that the Web3 is a little bit underdeveloped here, and the attack surface is much larger, and it's more convenient for a hacker to go into Web3.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and but I think we will also dive deeper into the open versus closed source discussion in a second. But yeah, let's talk a little bit more about Halborn precisely. So can you explain to us more specifically what Halborn does and moreover how you guys work? So say a custom blockchain that is about to launch reaches out to you and asks, hey, we would like to use your services. What does the procedure look like? And would this also be like kind of a replacement for a huge internal security team?
Nope, not at all. So, and I'm glad you asked the question in that way, because there is that misconception that, hey, I had a firm look at it, so we're good to go. Absolutely not. And if you look, again, borrowing a page out of the Web 2 world, security vendors such as Halborn that exist in the Web 2 world are just one piece of that security stack. The assessment services, or what's referred to as audit. I don't love the word audit because it brings this notion of an attestation of the code, and it's really just an assessment looking for vulnerabilities. But there's this misconception that let me just go take my code and go out and get this audit and give it to the community and say, look, my code has been reviewed by this organization, therefore it must be good. That's entirely a falsity. That's not accurate at all, because there's two things that I need to point out. First one is that audit, number one, or that assessment is a point in time. So it's looked upon January 1st. By February 1st, there might be a 0-day vulnerability that was discovered. So the assessment that was done January 1st may not be applicable in today's world, because the threat actors' techniques are always evolving. That's number one. Number two, I see many projects get an audit on January 1st and make code changes January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, but yet they're still advertising, hey, I got an assessment by XX company, so therefore my code is good. The community doesn't look. In every report, here's a hash of the commit that we reviewed. Check the hash of what you're actually communicating with. It's probably different. So therefore, the audit that was reviewed, I don't know what code was changed if I was a user, but I think people are just running, to interact without really doing their own due diligence. So I think, that conception I think is wrong. But, to go back to your question as to, my ideal customer is somebody that comes to us and understands that the threat landscape is not just smart contract code. There's so many other points of exploitation, within that, entire cycle. Just to name a few is, your CI/CD, your DevOps process. Code can get inserted after. So even though, something is getting reviewed, if there's the ability to say take code to go from staging or development directly to production with no checks or balances or any sort of safeguards in place, then what is reviewed is really irrelevant, because somebody could just go earlier in the process and inject code that gets released on the next release. Because what was reviewed isn't necessarily you hit a button and it goes into production. So that whole CI/CD is a point of exploitation. Going into key management, that's another area too. Whoever holds the keys can upgrade the smart contract. So again, whatever's reviewed doesn't necessarily mean that 10 seconds after it's reviewed that somebody can just exploit the keys and upgrade the contract. And there's tons more that come into that. So I think as a community, we have to understand the different threats and we have to demand better.
So one of the threats you were mentioning in the beginning of this answer, what I found very interesting is that more or less a lot of projects are just looking for the Halborn label, so to speak. Then they change something further down the road, and then nobody really tracks if the code is still secure, right?
Yes. Correct. And it's not just Halborn. It's all the other security vendors. We're in a tough position where a project that we may have worked with 2 years ago gets exploited, and then it's, well, this particular project was audited by so and then so and so's name gets dragged in the mud, and it's like, you're in a tough position. Do you want to call out your client and say, hey, we did the review 2 years ago, we have no idea what they're doing today? And the community also, some people will jump to the defense of the security vendor and actually point that out, and some people just say, this project was audited by so and because so and so audited it, it should be good, and it's not, and it got exploited, and therefore there's a negative reputation on that organization. So I just think that then that doesn't happen necessarily in the Web 2 world. I think there's more maturity in the space to understand that an assessment is just one piece of what an organization needs to do. A well-oiled machine in the Web 2 world will have a really comprehensive internal review process as well. They're doing their own static code analysis, dynamic code analysis. They have their own red teamers. The assessment at the end should really be almost the last step of when we get the code, we should be turning back and saying, we found 0 vulnerabilities. That's the ideal state. By the time it gets to us, we're just confirming that we don't see anything that you guys missed. And that's really where we should end up. If we receive a project where we find 20, 30, 40, 50 critical vulnerabilities, that means there's something fundamentally wrong with that organization's cybersecurity program, that those vulnerabilities were not found before the code made its way over to us.
Yeah, that's. I think this is very important to mention here, and also I want to dive deeper into this procedure here. So, I mean, you mentioned it in the beginning, everything is open source, and then you have the situation that yeah, code is always being updated, being changed. So if you get like the auditing stamp, so to say, in the beginning, you get the label, everything looks secure, then I mean, the ideal outcome is that this company gets, yeah, audits on a regular basis, no? That would be the outcome.
Yeah, it would be audits on a regular basis. It would be, what is their own internal procedure? Like if someone came to me and said, how do I evaluate a DApp? The first thing I would tell them again is look on LinkedIn, look at their security team, see who's comprised, who they're comprised of. I would look for white papers or just ask for their internal procedures. A lot of companies in the Web2 world will publish, here's our security white paper and how we secure your product. And they'll list through the steps and they'll talk about how they do, all these internal checks. They engage outside vendors to do these assessments. They'll get, in the world of Web2, or in regulated industries in the US at least, there's called a SOC 2, where it's an attestation over a period of time. So if you get a SOC 2 type 2, that means there's an auditing firm that is in your place of business potentially over a period of 12 months that are looking at not only like the code per se, but looking at your internal procedures. Because that's the other piece as well that I think a lot of organizations ignore is people, process, and technology. It's not just technology, it's also process. So they'll audit the process. So they'll look at how does code make its way from development into production, and what does that entire life cycle look like? And here are the controls to mitigate those risks. And let's make sure over a 12-month period that those controls are operating effectively. That's the maturity from the world that I come from that does not exist today in the Web3 world.
I see. And you mentioned these security white papers and Web2. How common are these how common are these in Web3?
I don't. I don't see them to the depth that I would see them in the Web2 world. And again, the Web2 world is a little bit more mature. They do have the SOC, the SOC 2s or the ISO, certifications. But I would tell somebody again, not necessarily to compare a small Web3 project to like a Salesforce or an Amazon, but go to Salesforce and look at their security white papers and just read the level of depth that they talk about. And again, they're not going to get into the intricacies of their internal processes, but they'll list out, these are all the things that we do as an organization. They have security operation centers. They have 24/7 people looking for, indications of attack and indications of compromise. That doesn't yet exist in the Web3 world. So you can have the best preventative controls in place, but if you don't have that detective side of the house as well, it's just like, in a home. I have a deadbolt in my house, but I know that somebody can easily kick the door open or break a window and get into my house, which is why I have an alarm system, and you can have motion detectors. And then, well, what happens if somebody cuts the phone line? Well, I have a cellular backup. Like, it's that same type of defense in depth that exists in the Web2 world that are present in the security white papers that kind of walk through, here's all the things that we do as an organization. That level of maturity, again, I don't see yet, proliferated in the Web3 world.
Yeah, I feel there's a lot that Web3 can still learn from Web2, especially in the security sector. But let's talk a little bit about mistakes and security gaps in Web3. So what are some mistakes and security gaps that you as an auditor see most of the time when reviewing the code of a blockchain, for example? And also a question that I'm personally very interested in is, what is actually more complex to audit, a blockchain or a smart contract?
Good question. It's, I would say that as far as difficulty, definitely I would say a layer one itself, that, the code base is obviously, a lot more expansive, and, just the threats and the implications are a lot greater, right? Like if an entire layer one is compromised, every single smart contract, potentially every single asset on it. So I think just the fact that the potential yield or the potential result of an attacker is higher. I think just the level of scrutiny is harder. But looking at a DApp, there's definitely code exploits and code vulnerabilities. And the other piece of it is just like business logic exploits. And I think that's where I think a lot of Web3 organizations are missing the boat on. It's not necessarily looking for, your standard, let me exploit a particular code. It's what is your DApp supposed to be doing fundamentally? And can someone sit down and just not social engineer it, but figure out a way to exploit it without exploiting the code? And that's the most difficult piece of it, because it's not a hack. If you look at, like, for example, like a sandwich attack isn't a hack or isn't an attack, right? Like I hate that word because it's not. They're just taking advantage of the way the mempool works and the way transactions are stacked, based on fees, and they're able to game the system in certain respect. So I think that's the more difficult piece to review. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing also in the Web3 world is this commoditization of smart contract audits or assessments, in the sense that, like, can we do them for cheaper? Can we do them automated? Can we run them through automated schools, code scanners? And they're not going to pick up those types of business exploits, or the ability to game the code without necessarily hacking it. So I think that's the difficulty piece, is really getting somebody to fully understand not only what the code does from a technical perspective, but also understanding from a business perspective, understanding from a financial perspective. If this is, a lending protocol, how is it actually working? How is it checking the prices of an oracle or something like that? Like, those are the things where it's like, well, I can exploit this because I know it's getting the price from this oracle. And I know that if I, create a fake LP pool over here, I can artificially raise the price. That's not code that's going to get picked up by a scanner. That's going to get picked up by a person that's thinking through logically, well, how is somebody going to be using this, and how could I potentially exploit it? It's a different mindset.
I see. And let's talk a little bit about this mindset and how all of this works, because I found this very interesting when we talked about this back in Barcelona. So how do most of the crypto exploits actually occur today? Is it really only the code that is sometimes insecure, or is there also human failure involved?
Definitely human failure. The conversation we had, and I apologize for cursing, but I think I remember something I said along the lines of, I could literally own every single fucking project in this summit. And again, tongue in cheek, I half meet and I half don't. And it really comes down to just people, and it comes down to poor operational security. One of the things that I find shocking is the telegraphing of where I'm going to be. I'm going to be at this event, and let's go to all these conferences and come meet up. And all of these founders are bringing their laptops with them, and they're whipping them out in public, and they're sitting down and they're typing. I mean, I could have at the Barcelona summit just stood up at the balcony and just had a camera and just watch everybody type in their passwords and into the like, it's poor OPSEC. Doing stuff in a hotel lobby as well. There's cameras all over the place. Like, there's just certain things that, from a traditional security perspective, that we're just trained, from being in the industry for 20, 30 years. Like, there's certain things we just don't do. And some of those things are telegraphing where we're going to be, being really careful as to keying in certain passwords if we're in a public place, because there could be people with cameras looking. And again, I know this sounds, very Mission Impossible type things, but it's happening, especially since the potential, result is hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions. If I can spend, $500 on a high-powered camera and watch you type in your password into a keyboard, at a summit, because you're doing some coding while you're sitting at a thing, I'll buy that if I'm going to be a threat actor. And that's just one piece. Signing up for all these side events with your cell phone number. It's very easy to do a SIM card swap now, or port somebody's phone number away. Very poor OPSEC when it comes to, just sharing of information. I can't tell you how many times I jump on Zooms with people and I just see confidential information in the background. Same thing with posting pictures on LinkedIn. So, and just even taking, somebody being at a hotel, I think one of the conversations we talked about is, again, I'm sure, again, everybody's guilty of it. They're just throwing their laptop in, the safe. Well, you know what? Those safes are not designed to be, fully secure, very easily broken into. You could just Google the instructions on how to break into the safe, because it's meant to be get into in case someone forgets their password. So number one, I can just slip, one of the housekeepers $500 to let me in the room, or just even easier, I can swap out one of your charging cables that you leave out, because it's just more convenient to leave them out, with this one that looks exactly the same. That has, and I'm not going to give the name of it because I'm not going to, tell people where to buy these things, but you can buy a cable for $100 online that allows you to remote inject code into devices remotely. Now you don't even have to get access back to the cable. They have Wi-Fi capabilities in these cables that I can now inject into it. So good operational security would be, bring a Chromebook. You don't bring your work laptop, bring a Chromebook, and then immediately you get back from these conferences, wipe them. Like, it's just, there's certain things that we're just used to in the world that I come from that I just see being done really poorly in the Web3 world.
Yeah, I think this sounds very James Bond-like for a lot of people, but obviously it happens. And I think what I find interesting in this discussion is also, I think you are still from the Web 2 generation, so to speak. I don't want to call you old, but I think you get my point, because yeah. I am from the young generation. I was growing up with Instagram and Facebook. Yeah. So when I didn't have Facebook in 2013 or 2012, I was uncool, and I was growing up with giving my data away and telling everyone where I am, yes, and telling that I am on vacation right now. but yeah, the Web 2 industry didn't grow up with that, right? They grow up without internet in the beginning, and then eventually they learn from scratch that it's not smart to share everything where you are. And would you say this is also like kind of a generational conflict here, that Web3 is so young that they, don't know this, cheap tricks that hacker can do, like giving like the maid $500, for example?
Yeah, yes and no, right? I think it's also, yes, 100%, right? Like, I have kids that are, my oldest is 17, and, he's not concerned with privacy like I am, and again, I don't know if it's just, age per se, or if it's just the generation I grew up in. Like, quick example is, I'm just generally aware that, like, hey, when you advertise a funeral in the newspaper, burglars can go to your house because they know the entire family is going to be out of the house. You just advertise to the entire world that you're not going to be home on the day of a funeral. Like, it's just certain things that, like, but it could also just be my mindset. When you think like an offensive person, you think like a red teamer, you think, if I were to own that project, how would I do it? And these are the techniques that I'm just aware of, and this is how I would do it. So I don't know if it's a generational thing or it's also just a mindset thing, because I think what I'm seeing in the Web3 world is really, again, pardon my language, fucking smart people that are doing some really crazy shit with this new technology, but they're not security people. So I think it's generational, but I think it's also just the lack of like shepherding in security people, because this isn't new concepts in the security world. They've been around. So, I don't know, grab the guy with the gray hair or the gray beard and bring him into your project, because he'll walk you through these things. But then again, even there's really smart 20-year-olds that understand this from a security perspective. So I think it's just also this mindset of, I'm going to build, and I hear this a lot. I'll look at security later. Once I get traction on my project, I just got $3 million. I'm not going to go spend 500,000 of it on security. I need to hire developers to get traction, and then I'll go back and secure it later. I hear that a lot when I talk to projects. So I think it's just a mindset of, you need to be secure from day one. Foundationally, you need to be secure. Security can be a differentiator in your product. Advertise, my DApp is more secure than this DApp. Listen, there's no unique DApp anymore. Every DApp, there's tons of competitors that do it. Make security your differentiator from a marketing perspective. Hey, we've decided to allocate 20 to 30% of our funds on security. Well, you know what? As a user, that might draw me over to them. So I think it's also shifting of the mindset. But yeah, you're right. Like, they grew up in an environment where, let me go on Snapchat and, like, enable Snap Map and everybody can see exactly where I am, or let me go to Instagram and tag my location. So I think it is generational to understand that. And again, listen, I do that on a personal level, right? Like, if I'm, visiting somewhere, I may, check in. Well, not, that's years ago on Facebook. I don't do that anymore. But like, I would check in, but I'm doing it where I know I don't necessarily have anything that's confidential with me. So it's also like, I'm not saying you have to go become a hermit and not telegraph to the world or participate in this wonderful world of social media to tell people where you are. But, when you're doing it in a way, in a Web3 world where you potentially have, confidential data information on you, or you can, potentially get owned, maybe, be a little bit more careful there. You know what? You want to say that you were at the summit? Great. Do it later. Don't do it while you're there. Don't live stream. Don't, say you just got here, so happy to be here. Get home. Then say, had a great time at the Avalanche Summit, and here's all the things, and here's all the pictures, but you're not there anymore. Like, you could still do it, but just do it a little bit more pragmatically.
I see. And let's dive deeper into precisely this advice, because as I mentioned, crypto people are often on the road. So we visit conferences on a very regular basis, also hackathons. So I would be interested in a travel security kit from you.
Sure. Number one, like I said, full disk encryption. And that's the number one thing that I'm beyond shocked that, people don't have that turned on. So full disk encryption, again, whatever operating system you're using, they all will support full disk encryption. So if you lose your device, at least it's encrypted. Have the ability to do a remote wipe. Don't bring your work PC. You shouldn't be having to sit there and do work while you're at a conference. Like, it should be more about business development and going to the talks and learning. If you need a PC, bring a Chromebook that's wiped when you got back, because you don't know if there's any sort of zero-day vulnerabilities that were just inserted into your work laptop. And then when you get back to your work environment, into your VPNing, into whatever you're doing, if you're remote, that you've just now injected that code. So bring a device and wipe it when you get back. Same thing with phones too. We have the ability to back up and restore, or bring a burner phone, like, not like a flip phone you bought at a gas station, but a lot of people I know in the security world pop out their SIM, pop it into a phone, and then when they get back, they wipe it. I don't necessarily need all my apps on my phone, so I could just, bring my, secondary phone, pop in my SIM, do what I need to do. When I get back, wipe that phone and put it back on my main phone. Don't bring any of your main technology that you normally bring with you. Again, don't tell everybody where you're going. Don't post it online. Charging cables, definitely take possession of them and keep them as safe as you would your laptop. Don't leave them plugged into your hotel room and just thinking I can get back and plug them in. That's a huge area that I think, again, if you really want to get like super paranoid, don't necessarily book a hotel room under your name, under your company credit card, because again, I could just go to the front desk, slip them $500 and say, give me the room numbers of everybody checked in under Coinbase. Now I know the rooms and I can go in there. Maybe I install some cameras. Again, it sounds far-fetched, but for $500, I can go do that. And then if I know that, somebody high up within one of these organizations is staying at that hotel, and now I know the room number, and I can put listening devices in, or I can access their device, there's billions of dollars at stake. Like it is being done. Like, just because you don't necessarily see how a hack has happened, or necessarily that you don't hear about a hack happen, doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. There are tons of exploits that are not want to say covered up, but are not necessarily like advertised. If it's not a DeFi protocol where you can see the hack, if it's a centralized exchange, they don't necessarily have to tell you that they've experienced any sort of security breach or vulnerability. So this stuff is actually happening. So don't buy anything on your company credit card. Don't necessarily use your real name. If you want to get super paranoid when you get to the hotel, what room number am I? Oh, you're 342. Thank you. I'd like to request a new room. So that way, if your room was compromised, you just ask for a new room. You can buy things on Amazon that you can walk around and you can look for cameras, and you can look for RF ID, and you can look for different things that are admitting, so you can see if there's any listening devices in the room. And then also, again, just good OPSEC. I have no idea why the crypto community uses Telegram. I'm on Telegram. I have to be on Telegram because I talk to it. Telegram's not necessarily something that I would advocate for private and secure communication. It's not end-to-end encrypted. And if you are doing the end-to-end encryption, you have to specifically go in and enable it. And I have not had one person in the crypto community actually turn on end-to-end encryption. So everybody that's communicating in Telegram, it's not encrypted. I would obviously tell everybody to use Signal. So that's when I need to talk securely, I do Signal phone calls, and I do Signal chat. I will not use Telegram. But I have to use Telegram because that's what the crypto community is generally used to, understood, because it's convenient to set up the groups, etc. So it's really just being more situationally aware as well. Again, you can own an asset just by coming and talking to them and gaining their trust. So to just be wary of people coming up to you and talking to you. There's when we used to give briefing for executives, when in the Web2 world, and especially in banking, when they're traveling overseas, again, be on the lookout for you're at the hotel bar and somebody comes up and sits down next to you and starts talking to you. Could be friendly, and it could be somebody that knows that you're here from such and such bank, or in Web3 world such and such project, and they're just trying to gain your trust, so that way they can when you go to the bathroom, they can go into your bag and put something in there. So again, just know that this stuff is happening. I think is probably the biggest takeaway from this talk. Is just this stuff isn't just in the movies. It actually is happening. It's techniques that have been used for years and years and years and years.
And now let's talk a little bit about the frequency of how much this stuff happens. So I remember there was like this shockingly increase of exploits mid 2021 when we were like in this crazy bull market. All of a sudden, you had like exploits on an almost daily basis in the news, and then also 2022, obviously. So I mean, you read the articles on Cointelegraph, on CoinDesk, and then there's like a short technical explanation of what happened on a high level. But how often does it happen that, one of the scenarios that you just described were the reason for the exploit? Like maybe not a number, but like just like a rough estimation percentage-wise.
I don't know the rough, percentage-wise, because again, a lot of those figures and numbers aren't necessarily advertised, because a lot of these types of ownings, number one, are never discovered as to how it actually happens. So again, if you see a hack and there's no underlying cause or underlying reason, like perfect example right now is, I think we've seen some of the OG wallets and funds start moving around. Everybody's speculating as to how is it actually happening. You may never know, and it could have been an insider threat, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago that was able to steal code on seed generation for some of these devices. Like, we don't necessarily know how some of the major hacks are necessarily happening. We can speculate. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. The other piece to realize also is, like I said, not every single exploit is public. We see what we see because of like the DeFi protocols. But I'm not saying Coinbase is hacked, but if Coinbase were to be hacked, they don't necessarily, and again, outside of requirements of breach notification laws, whatever. But if it's a centralized authority or a centralized organization, they don't necessarily have to. I can tell you, actually within the past week, I got a notification. It was LOL. Somebody just interviewed for my organization from North Korea. So again, this is that Axie Infinity hack where you have North Korea trying to get in. Again, this person is a security professional, and they were I quickly identified that the person who they were interviewing is not the person who applied, and that they were able to identify from their perspective or intelligence that this person was coming. And again, I didn't ask the specifics as to how they determined it, but this was as of last week. Somebody said somebody from North Korea just tried to interview at my organization.
Yeah, that sounds very James Bond-like, but wow.
It is. I mean, like the typical way this typically happens is, this was obviously, I don't know how this person found out, but the person that you're interviewing may not be the person who you're actually hiring. So they could be hiring, like a developer from say India or from another location, and in reality, once they get the job and once they get the credentials and once they're onboarded, they just hand them over to North Korea. And then North Korea is the one who's actually working at your organization, and it's not the person that you spoke to or the person that you speak to online. So it's literally like an actor, if you will, or somebody that's getting paid in order to pretend to be the employee when in reality, the credentials are held by somebody else. That happens.
And I think, now that I think about it, I think with AI, for example, where you can imitate things much easier now, I think this risk like increases actually.
100%. Yes. I mean, because now, like one of the big tells sometimes is the way the person speaks or grammatical mistakes, etc. I mean, those are the really bad ones. But with AI, I can now automate the communication back and forth.
Yeah, that's actually very shocking. And also, North Korea like joined the chat here very, very randomly. But interesting, really interesting to know that. And now talking about these areas of the world, what areas would you say are a little bit more risky to travel to as a crypto person? I'm not talking about these kidnapping scenarios that people had in their minds when traveling to Bogota, but just saying like generally, if you're a crypto person, you're going to a conference in that country, where should you be extra careful?
Yeah, the areas obviously are definitely China, Russia, obviously. Anywhere where there's like nation state controlled infrastructure, to me, is the riskiest. In China, all the telecommunications companies are state owned and state managed. So, again, when we had certain executives traveling to certain countries, we didn't even allow them to bring their personal devices or even any sort of laptops, because there's just a general assumption that there could be over the air exploits, put into those machines. Now, again, somebody in the Web3 world, like, again, I fully am aware and cognizant that some of the stuff I'm talking about is just untenable, right? You don't necessarily have the funds or the ability or the wherewithal to do all of these things. So my message is really more about situational awareness and just to be a little bit more careful and to do certain things that you normally wouldn't do, and just to be aware of, like, bringing the Chromebook and wiping the device when you get back. But definitely I would look at, countries where hacking is really sponsored from a nation state perspective, like a China or a Russia, I would generally be aware of. But really, like anytime I do any sort of traveling, I really kind of take that same operational security. So honestly, just anytime you travel, because you're not necessarily having the same physical security you do within your home. You're in a hotel, even if I travel within the United States, I take the same precautions if I travel overseas.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting here to know. And totally makes sense. But now we just talked a lot about crypto founders, obviously, that are like more or less targeted. But let's talk a little bit about the average user and the average crypto holder. I think that would be like also very interesting to know here. So what is some general advice here for someone who has $1,000 in a wallet? I think that would be also like very important to know here.
Sure. So what was the question? So general advice for
people? General advice, because I mean, there's like this conflict. Hey, generally I can have my own private keys, but you also need to write them down eventually, right? Because if you forget them, then you run into problems. So how should we behave as an average
Yeah.
person?
So absolutely, and that's a great question, right? Like, the most secure way of doing it is, the generation of the seeds, completely offline. And it's not just, understanding that, seed generation is not seed generation is not seed generation. Like there's different techniques. Like there was the profanity hack, which was an exploit in the way that the seeds were generated. So it's looking into, and again, you don't have to be a cryptographer, but like there's just certain industry standards, where you, like, if you look at the CCSS standards, they go through like level 1, level 2, level 3. I would just look at what's been adopted by the CCSS standards by C4 and look at seed generation, which algorithms. Randomness is another issue. If there's not true randomness in it, you could potentially lead to brute forcing. But as far as like operational security, the one thing that I would truly recommend is doing everything offline in air gap machines, and wiping and destroying those machines after those seeds are generated. Because again, if you're doing it on an online machine, it's potentially still in memory someplace, which can be scraped or could be exploited. Halborn found a 0-day vulnerability in MetaMask, which was exactly that vulnerability. The seeds after they were generated were potentially pulled out. But using a device, again, we can get into the ledger for whatever minutes we have left, but using a hardware device is definitely more secure, because by design they should not be able to be extractable. And then talking about backing up of the seeds, it's really where are they stored and how are they encrypted and how are they backed up. So again, you want to shard them. Take if you have a 24 seed, maybe break them up into 4 different chunks and put them in 4 different locations and have them double encrypted. I mean, if you do something like that, you're really creating so many different roadblocks for a potential threat actor to get access to those seeds. If you have, say, and again, I'm not necessarily condoning or recommending this, just giving an example. If you double encrypted them and stored one in Dropbox, and you stored one in TreasureIt, and you stored one in an S3 bucket in AWS, you now theoretically have to breach 3 different environments, break through, two levels of encryption just to get to those seed words. So there are ways to back things up from a resiliency perspective, but putting them on multiple different providers, using double layers of encryption. Don't use the same encryption technique. So, maybe AES and, something else. But there's different really low tech, nice ways of backing these things up.
Yeah, very well said. And I see we are like running a little bit out of time. So unfortunately, we won't make it to the discussion between open source versus closed source, and also unfortunately not to the ledger announcement that was brought up recently. So one wrap up question here from my end. I mean, all of this sounds super scary if you review this interview. So will we like actually ever enter the state where you could say, yes, Web3 is mature enough to be secure for the masses, or does everything depend on education and educating the individual?
No, I think we're going to get to a good place, maybe not necessarily in the next 3-6 months, but 12 to 24 months. There's a lot of really great Web3 security startups that are entering the space that are trying to, fill the gap that doesn't exist, like, whatever the CrowdStrike or Sentinel-1 equivalent of Web3 will be. Really mature security operation centers, managed threat monitoring of, looking for anomalies, looking for indications of compromise. As these companies, mature more, raise additional rounds, being able to attract some of the talent that exists in the Web 2 world. Coinbase did that, right? Coinbase hired Jeff Lungelhofer, who is the former CISO for BNY Mellon. That is such an amazing move of like, hey, we're a Web3 organization, but we're going to go and we're going to hire, one of the best CISOs in traditional finance and bring him over, to Coinbase to help stand up what he did in the banking world. That is a huge, huge, huge move. And I think that's such an amazing move that, again, I don't know why that didn't get more press than it did, but I think that telegraphed to the world that like Coinbase is taking security very seriously. We're going to go hire some of the giants in the Web 2 world and help us secure it. So I think we're starting to see really strategic hires in the Web 2 world as funding increases, as the market starts filling in the, missing the gap of the tools that don't yet exist. And I just think of just general maturity in the space. I think we'll get to a point where we can do things securely in this world, but also as users, we have to stop chasing the quick buck, because I think that's also what's giving credibility to some of these projects of, again, I'm not going to get into the whole, Pepe coin and all that bullshit, but like, hey, I want to buy a bullshit meme coin, or I'm going to jump into this LP or whatever it is because I want to make 1,000% yield. That's not helping things, because those are the projects that generally get rug pulled and owned.
Yeah, totally agree on this. And There's nothing more to add here. But yeah, again, unfortunately, we are like running out of time here. So yeah, thank you so much for joining, David. If you guys want to follow Halborn on social media and David, for example, then obviously these links are provided in the description below. And yeah, David, thank you so much for joining. Hope to have you on the show soon to maybe like talk again about Ledger and open source versus closed source. That would be amazing. But yeah.
I would love to. I have a lot to say about Ledger and open source and closed source. So, would love to come on again and chat about that.
100%. Yeah, then let's pick up the conversation there. But yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us and for joining.
All right. Thank you.